Hello, hello. This is Derek from One Over Tea. Welcome back to another episode of Tea Soup, a podcast all about tea culture, life in modern China, and Chinese tea. I'm your host, Derek Poskin. I've been living in China since 2016, and I've been drinking, buying, and selling Chinese tea for the past decade. So, pop on that kettle, heat up your teaware, and let's get this session started. Alright, so in that last episode, I talked a lot about the history of Longjing, the Dragon Well green tea from Hangzhou's Westlake area. I got deep into the culture, the history, and a little philosophical towards the end, but I make no apologies. In this episode, what I want to do is kind of take a step back and give you a little bit more context as to this one person who keeps popping up in my stories here. It's my tea master, and I just got back from a 5-day trip with him all through Zhejiang and Hangzhou, Suzhou, and Jiangsu, and it has been fantastic. In Suzhou, we saw my tea master's handmade Bilochun guy, and then in Zhejiang, he introduced me. In Hangzhou, my tea master introduced me to some of the biggest masters around, people that are selling their teas for tens of thousands of dollars. And that's just from a few of the price lists I saw, not from asking what's the most elite they have there. It was really interesting getting into Hangzhou, seeing all of these people that really, really know their stuff. Because one trend I've seen in China is that a lot of people that specialize in a particular tea, when you talk about any other type of tea, they're very quickly out of their depths. If you talk about oolong to a green tea maker, maybe they'll know a few. They'll know Anshi Tieguanyin, they'll know Da Hong Pao or Roguewei. But if you ask them their preferences are very tertiary. They don't know this subject in depth, and they're not really interested in experimenting with it. But one thing I saw in Hangzhou is that everyone has a deep appreciation and knowledge of the entire scope of Chinese teas, as far as my general impression that I got talking to these top masters and stuff. Walking back a bit from the Hangzhou area back to Suzhou, and even let's go further back. Let's go back to where this trip started in my home city right now. That's Yangzhou, Jiangsu. So for all of you dedicated listeners to Tea Soup, you'll remember at the end of one of the episodes recently, I mentioned that my tea master called me while I was recording and invited me on a trip to Suzhou to see the Bilochun and to the Westlake area to meet all his Longjing Dragonwell friends. And although I've been essentially apprenticed to this tea master for the past 7 years, I met him right my second week, is in Chinese they call it Yuanfen. I met him my second week in China. I was looking for a gaiwan because my gaiwan was broken on the airplane and I didn't have anything to brew tea with. And I was walking around my city peeking in at tea shops, and I peek in at his, and he has a whole shelf of just like beautiful antique teaware from the Qing dynasty, from Taiwan, stuff like this, things that have been repaired with kintsugi and silver staples. And so I walk in and I'm just looking at all the teaware. We start talking and we just kind of hit it off. He's a very, very relaxed guy. So am I, if you haven't noticed. And so the relationship started with a cup, with a gaiwan, me looking for a new one, him selling me one, and then inviting me to come back for tea, long conversations over tea, dinner. He's a fantastic cook. He used to do wedding catering here in China, and so he knows all the dishes. And so I was like, wow, there's so much I can learn from just standing here watching this guy, how to gut a fish and cook it the Chinese way. He's also a skilled guqin maker. Guqin is like the ancient Chinese instrument that's really, really long, really heavy, has like 6 thick strings, and you play it with your thumbnails and you're rolling your thumbs around it, sliding up and down. It's a really ancient instrument, and traveling with him recently, I realized like he is fairly famous for his guqins, and it's like just a side note to like this man that I've grown to know. Anyways, the idea kind of came around. I wanted to study not only how to make and taste Chinese tea, but also just understand more of Chinese culture. And so he's kind of fulfilled this, I call him my tea master, but he's really more of a Chinese cultural master, where he's teaching me, the etiquette for dining with friends and dining with people above your station, below your station, all of these subtle things that growing up outside of China, I just missed on my unconscious conditioning. And so he's kind of teaching me, what's the proper gifts, what's too much, what's not enough, how do you address people. And so I've learned a whole lot of Chinese culture from him, though it's not exclusively about tea. And so, although I've been an apprentice to him for the past 7 years, this is really the first time he's taken me out on a tea trip, which kind of sounds ridiculous, but we'll get into later his views on the master apprentice relationship. And so, my relationship with my tea master is very unique. Of course, you can find very specific, very dedicated tea teachers here in China who will teach you how to properly pour the gaiwan, hold the gaiwan, present the tea, taste the tea, analyze the tea. My tea master is a little more relaxed, and he kind of teaches me the whole general scope of what it is to be in the cultured Chinese circles, how to interact with people, what's polite, what's impolite. It's not all about tea. And so my tea master, when I mention him, it's a more of an honorific, as I'm not directly studying from him how to make tea or how to drink tea. However, he is a certified master here in China, and certification in China is pretty ridiculous. It's very difficult to get. A lot of times it comes in your later years of life when, the government bodies recognize the work you're doing to promote the intangible culture of one thing or another. And I mention this as a reference to the future when I talk about some of the tea masters I met in Hangzhou's Westlake area. And so there is a huge difference here between a teacher and a master, and that's the Da Shi versus the Lao Shi. And my tea master actually recently got awarded his master certificate plaque, if you will, and so he has a certified studio, a workspace here in Yangzhou, and he does actually make his own red and green tea. And so that's where this story begins. Me going over to his tea house, called the Shangshan Tang Tea House, and drinking some of the fresh tea that he had just made a few days ago. So my tea master's name is Yinwei. I call him Shifu. Other people call him Ying Shifu. Other people call him Ying Shishong. Other people call him Lao Ying, which is like probably the most familiar, the least professional is just calling him Old Ying. And that Ying is his surname. And so you just call him, hey, Old Ying. And that's what I call people who are roughly around my own age. If they're slightly older than me, I'll just call them Old last name. If they're slightly younger than me, I'll call them Shao, which is little, and last name. And so I met a guy at the tea house recently, and his name was Lin, and he told me he was a tiger 2 years older than me, and I was like, oh, hello, Lao Lin, and everyone was laughing, and he's like, perfect, that's great. There's another guy I buy Dansong Oolong from who's significantly younger than me, and I call him Xiao Shu, and Shu is actually his first name, and that's his given name, and so it becomes even more kind of familiar and not as formal when you kind of are talking to somebody who's younger than you. It's just a very interesting subtext in the Chinese naming conventions, calling conventions, and Chinese culture. Anyways, so I get over to his workspace studio, and I haven't been here since a few months. I actually am probably not the most studious 2D apprentice. I get a little too busy with my own One River Tea company and this podcast and the tea travels, of course. Anyways, I should go there more. But when I go there, he's already packaging up his Mingqian Luyang Chun. And what is Luyang Chun? Luyang Chun is the Yangzhou cultivar that makes the green tea here. It was created in, I think, the 1990s and started getting very popular around then. It became a kind of tuchan. Tuchan is like a specialty product. And that's huge in China. If you ever travel and you go to another city, go to another province, they have these specialty shops of like specialty. It's not souvenirs necessarily. It's just things that this area is known for. So maybe if you go to Hubei or Wuhan, Wuhan is very famous for its spicy like chicken jerky, if you will. So it's this like dried, really spicy parts of a chicken. And you can get that in Wuhan. If you go to Hubei, they're really famous for their bacon. They're like salted meats and stuff like that. And so you'll go to the specialty shop and it'll just be salted meats. In Yangzhou, you go to a specialty shop and you will see this Luyang Chun green tea. Now, in naming convention, Luyang Chun is very similar to what we'll see here in a second, the Bilo Chun. That last character, that means spring. So Chun, spring. Bilo is like a green snail, while Lu Yang has kind of no real meaning. Like Lu is green, and then Yang is similar to the Yangzhou Yang, and so it could mean like green plum spring, which actually sounds a lot better than the green snail spring of Suzhou. But this is the only similarity I see in these two green teas. Although they're both Jiangsu teas, they're very, very different. The Luyang Chun is made in needle-like shapes, very small, almost one leaf, one bud exclusively, and just really, really tiny, slightly pressed, slightly flat, and they don't have any fuzz on them at all. Where the Bilo Chun is almost completely the opposite, where it's really, really spindly, twisty, curly, with a lot of fuzz and down. In taste, this Luyang Chun is very, very green, vegetal, like green bell peppers, like cucumbers. It's really, really crisp and refreshing, where the Bilo Chun is very, very citrusy, thick in the mouth, and umami flavored. The Luyang Chun, in my opinion, is a little lighter. So I get there, and he's packaging up his New Year's, just made a few days ago, Luyang Chun, and he gives me a cup of it, and I realize this is my first taste of a 2023 green tea. And I've seen on Instagram, and I've seen a lot of people buying, drinking, selling all of these early Sichuan teas. And I was like, that's interesting, but it's really not my cup of tea, if you will. I'm much more the Jiangsu, Fujian area. And so I have to wait a little longer before I can get the first fresh tea. And usually this comes right around the vernal equinox. March 20th is really when picking kind of gets underway here. So this is March 27th, and my tea master has been going out to his small bit of leased land from a local cooperative that tends a lot of tea gardens a little north of the city. And he leases a few mu there, like maybe an acre of land or a couple of acres. He oversees the picking and the processing. He doesn't pick it himself. He doesn't tend the fields. He doesn't tend the plants. He's not a farmer. He doesn't quite understand that. What he understands is how to take it from the fresh leaf that's just been picked into the finished tea. And he's been studying this for several decades probably by now. And he really understands when you need to do all the different steps. And the place that he rents, that he leases, has the whole production facility there. So he can go in and have a team of people that already loosely know how the green tea is made. And so he can direct them, orchestrate them, tell them when to do what. And so this is kind of the master level status of being able to understand the process so thoroughly and tell other people what to do. And while he does make batches of green tea every year, his pet project is the red tea. This is the Yanhua Hong Firework Red. Now, why is this tea his favorite tea? Why is it his pet project? First of all, it's because in this region, in Yangzhou, there's nobody who's been making red tea. Red tea doesn't exist here. Red tea or black tea, if you will. Yangzhou is not famous for its red tea. It is loosely famous since the 90s for its green tea, that Luyang Chun. There have been attempts over the years to make a suitable red tea, but nobody's really succeeded until now. So my tea master is really one of the first people in the area to make a successful rendering of the Luyang Chun in a red style. And I know this kind of sounds simple, right? We have this theory that all the different teas come from one type of plant, the Camellia sinensis. You can pick it, you can make this 6 different styles of tea. The white, the green, the blue, that's oolong, the yellow, the black, that's fermented tea in the Chinese, and then also the red, which we call black tea in the West. And in fact, it's precisely upon this idea that we've created the One River tea name, because just as one river might have many tributaries, smaller streams that feed into it and eventually empty out into the river, tea in China has so many different styles, so many small varietals, so many different branches of the 6 styles of tea, but they're all the same plant. It's all one culture. It's all flowing in the same river. And of course, we can get more metaphysical with it, where everything in this world is flowing in the same river. We're all part of the same environment. And there's this sense of interconnected with where everything seems so different, and yet at its core, at its root, it's all one, it's all connected. And this getting back into the Tao Te Ching, which I was talking about last episode, I think, where there's the beginning of the universe, there's the Wu Ji, which is the void. And upon the Wu Ji, you get the Tai Ji, and the Tai Ji is the great ultimate. And then the Tai Ji breaks into one side is yin and one side is yang, and this is the yin yang. which stands upon the Wuji, the great infinite. And from these myriad, from these two forces of opposition, they and then shatter further and break further and break further. Then everything in this world is comprised of elements of these yin and yang energies, but ultimately everything is sitting on this great void. And so to the truly enlightened mind, where you might perceive everything is so different, is so distinct, it is all the same thing. And so with tea, we see this, with the idea that there are many different styles, and yet they're all the same plant, and it's just small variations within it. And so getting back to the point here, while it might seem very simple to pick a tea and then process it as a green tea, process it as a white tea, as a red tea, as a black tea, it's actually much more complicated than this. I think I mentioned in one episode earlier that my partner Alex out in Hubei is looking at getting his certification for making Ensher Yulu or Hefeng Mao Jian. But his problem here is that if he gets a certification to make Hefeng Mao Jian, he can't make Huangshan Mao Feng, he can't make Ensher Yulu, he can't make Dragonwell because the styles are so different. And this is still green tea. And so when you really look at the tea making, the tea processing, and the tea masters, they're highly specialized. And this gets back into, I think, the first episode when we talk about the different styles of tea that emerged in the Song dynasty, people trying to copy it, and the fact that China is it's a land of mountains and rivers. Everything can be very isolated. Even the towns here within 50 kilometers, 100 kilometers, they have different languages, different dialects. And so you can imagine one person making tea in, Fuding, and then somebody making tea in Yunnan. These people do not have direct communication, especially in ancient times. And so these teas will come out incredibly differently. And as time progresses, we see a little bit of secrecy going on with the art of making tea, right? There's this whole espionage of the English coming in, trying to figure out the secrets of tea, and then taking it to India and stuff like that. But that's not the purpose of this episode. What I want to talk about is the fact that nobody has successfully made a red tea out of the green tea here in Yangzhou, which is, it seems very simple. I get a lot of people messaging me with like, oh, I would love to try a white tea made as an oolong tea. And it's like, in theory, yes. In theory, you can do it. It sounds great. But in practice, what you would probably need to do is you probably need to get a master who knows how to make white tea, and then a master who knows how to make oolong tea, get them in the same room and have them work together cooperatively to make this project. So getting back to my master and his Yanhua Hong red tea, he actually studied how to make black tea or red tea in Tongmuguan in northwestern Fujian. And this is right outside of the Wei Mountains. And so he went there a few times to study with the makers there and understand how to make the black tea there. And which is cool because Tongmuguan is the original birthplace of all black tea in the world. And I'll get into this later in the Tongmuguan episodes, but it's really cool that you can trace, very, very factually trace the origin of black tea to this small mountain village. And so he goes there and studies how to make black tea and then takes that knowledge back to Yangzhou and applies it to this Luyang Chun. And the reason this is okay is because he already knows how to make Luyang Chun, my tea master does. And then it's also uncharted territory because nobody has made a black tea out of this varietal. And so he has to put his knowledge into practice and see what he can do. After several attempts, he's gotten a really nice, high-quality tea, and this is the tea he's proud about. We just went on a huge tea trip to Suzhou, to Hangzhou, and even though he had just made, a few days ago, his Mingqian green tea, he brought a little bit of that, but he brought a whole lot of his black tea because that's what he's proud about. He even came up with the name by himself, this Yanhua Hong, or Firework Red, as I want to call it now. And what does this name mean? Firework Red. Naturally, it does sound really good. You see the firework burst, it's a flavor, it's very exciting, the name. But what he is actually doing with this name is he's doing what we've seen people throughout China, throughout the tea history do all the time. He's sanctifying this tea with a dose of traditional history. And so Yanhua Hong, this phrase is lifted from a very, very famous poem about Yangzhou, written by probably China's most famous poet, Li Bai. And the poem is one of the classic Chinese poems where it's seeing off a friend, a poem of parting. And this is, one of my first loves was Chinese poetry, and I studied it a whole lot in university. And these poems of parting are probably my favorite because there's so much mixed emotions of joy and sorrow, of a sweetness that's past and stuff like that. And so this is one of those style of poems. Thematically, it's the same as a lot of other Chinese poems, the poem of parting, and it's written by Li Bai, who is the famous Tang poet. I think he was right around 700s or something like that. And the poem is called Farewell to Meng Hao Jian at Yellow Crane Tower. Now, Yellow Crane Tower is an old temple tower in Wuhan. And what's happening in this poem is Li Bai met a friend, a poet in Wuhan. They spent some time together drinking, reciting poetry, as all the poets of the time did. And then his friend is leaving, and his friend is going south down the Yangtze River. As we mentioned earlier, the rivers are the ancient highways of China. And he's going south to Yangzhou. And this poem was actually one of the reasons I decided to first move to Yangzhou. And so when I first moved to China, I had a lot of options. I could live in Shanghai, Beijing, Guangzhou, a lot of really cool, nice, hip cities. But I wanted a city with traditional culture. I wanted a city that still had its roots in the ancient times. And I realized that Yangzhou was a very ancient city. And even in the Tang Dynasty, like 1,000 years ago, this city was not only well known, but also known as a beautiful place to travel in spring, and worthy enough for Li Bai to mention it in a poem. And this poem has been referenced by, the Yangzhou government all the time, just really emphasizing that sacred lineage of, we have our roots in traditional culture, whatnot. And so my tea master is taking the Yanhua from this. I'll read the poem here in a second, but this is the phrase smoke and flower. And this is a really beautiful phrase that Li Bai is using to just express the idea of spring in Yangzhou and spring along the Yangtze. And he's taken that phrase, the Yanhua, and turned it into his brand. And so he's connecting his brand of red tea that he's making with this 700 AD poem by the most famous poet that references Yangzhou. And so to the Chinese mind, this hits all the right notes. Speaking of, the poem goes like this in Chinese, so forgive my pronunciation if it's not so good. It goes, 孤人西死黄鹤楼，烟花三月下扬州。孤帆远影碧空尽，唯见长今天急流。And I've come across a pretty nice translation of this. I've translated it in the past, but for this moment, I'm just going to look at somebody else's translation of it by Staten Hager. I found it online real quick, but it's a good one. So the translation goes like this. It's called Farewell to Meng Hao Jian at Yellow Crane Tower by Li Bai. The poem reads, in April, the air thick with the smoky fragrance of wet blossoms. My friend and I exchange goodbyes at Yellow Crane Tower as he departs downriver east to Yangzhou. His lone sail fades from sight. Under a shadowy flicker, it sinks into the sky's limitless blue. Then I only see the great Yangtze pouring its waters through heaven's gates. Now, without hitting too hard of a tangent here, Chinese poetry is, as I mentioned, one of my first loves. Before Chinese tea, I had Chinese poetry. And what it's doing here is it's turning the whole world into essentially the world beyond our conception of the world. Everything is beautiful for itself. Everything has meaning. Nothing has meaning. It's this really interesting. A lot of people look at this from the outside and they think it's a pastoral piece. They think, oh, it's just a landscape painting. But to the ancient Chinese mind, the landscape is the divine. The natural world is the world of the gods, is the world that you can always connect with, and at one you are part of. It's like seeing your own self in the horizon, in this limitless separation from your friends, in the sail disappearing into the horizon. You realize everything will disappear into the horizon at one time and will come back from it at another time. And anyways, so the most famous phrase that's quoted by people all over China when I tell them I'm from Yangzhou, one is actually from Xi Jinping, the current chairman. He says, 扬州是好地方, which means Yangzhou is a good place. And people say this all the time. They love it. It's kind of giving the grace of God here. The second one that people always say to me is that 烟花三月下扬州. And this is the Yanhua that my tea master has taken for his Yanhua Hong. And the next lines would be San Yue Sha Yang Zhou. And so to the Chinese mind, they usually connect this. This is a poem that I can say the first two characters of it, and most people in China can recite the entire poem to me. It's just they learn it in primary school so much. It's really interesting. I play this game where I say the first couple lines of a poem and see if people can recite it. My favorite one to do it with is this one from the Chinese book of poems, this ancient tome, and it starts with it says goose 3 times. So it's And I did this with a bunch of kindergartners, and they all just started chanting the poem after I said, Really, really amusing. Anyways, so actually getting back to this Yanhua Hong, my tea master studied how to make it in the Wuyi Mountains, studied how to make black tea, took this knowledge back to Yangzhou, made his first few batches, and it was actually, he invited me. The first tea trip I took with my tea master was to his fields from this cooperative maintenance of the tea gardens that he's leased his land from, and I saw the first production of his Yanhua Hong, his red tea, and I actually made a YouTube video about it back 3 years ago. I think it has 80 views, so you're welcome to go check that out and see the whole process from start to finish. I won't go into the specifics of it because I'll probably talk more about black tea when I get into the Tongmuguan region and talk about that sourcing trip. But it was really fascinating to see my tea master in this new light, because in the past, my relationship with my tea master is very not very tea centric. I would say it's, as I mentioned earlier, it's more culturally sensitive, Chinese culture, and this is the first time seeing him don his tea maker's hat, and I realized, oh, there's so much more about you that I didn't realize you're very capable of doing, and this is my shortcoming. It's not his. I just see him as the guy who's, always just sitting behind the table, drinking tea, talking to friends and stuff like that. I don't see this depth of knowledge all of the time. And it's really cool to see him having this really intimate knowledge of when to rotate the tea, when to move the tea around, when to do the yao qing, testing the tea in all these different ways. And I realized, oh, you really know your stuff from the ins to the outs. And a lot of times for people who are really interested in tasting tea and being tea sommelier and stuff like that, it's very important to understand the processing and have a depth of knowledge about the processing of tea. That way, if you taste a tea that's sour, you can know exactly what happened. You can know it was probably piled too high, the heat was too hot during this phase, or it wasn't baked properly, it wasn't, the green wasn't killed enough, or it was killed too much. So if you understand the processing, and I've met people in the Dansong region who aren't tea makers, they just buy and sell dansong, but they were shadowing my tea master Wei. Wei has, 3-4 apprentices, people shadowing every year. And so this is somebody who's just trying to understand the processing of dansong so that he can taste it better. And so he has a shop in Chaozhou. He goes there and he learns the processing, not to make the tea, just to understand how to test it, how to taste it, and how to judge it. My tea master, on the other hand, he already knew that, and he is now putting into practice the next step of actually making his own batches. Now, this episode is kind of turning more into an homage to my tea master and kind of me explaining what a tea master in China is like for me, because my situation, as I mentioned, is very unique, and I think this is a very good topic for a lot of people to understand. My tea master and I's relationship is a traditional relationship between a master and his apprentice. This is different. There's a huge difference here between a teacher and a student, and a master and his apprentice. And when I first met this guy, who is now my tea master, he asked me if I wanted to study Chinese culture with him. And I said I did. And then his second question was, do you want to be an apprentice? Do you want to become my apprentice and take me on as your master? Or do you want me to be your teacher and you can be my student? And I said, they sound like the same thing. What's the difference? And he jokingly said, a teacher won't hit you, but your master might. And this is just really shows you the difference there, where there's a different depth of familiarity to it. If your teacher hits you, that's a bad teacher. You can just leave, find another teacher, whatever. If your master hits you, it's kind of like, oh, you did it wrong. And this is the traditional relationship between the master and the apprentice. It's a much more like a familial bond. In fact, the characters for master, it's shifu. I think in Cantonese it's like sifu, and also in Yangzhou Hua it's kind of like sifu. But shifu, the way the characters are, the first character is shi, which means teacher. The second character is Fu, which means father. And so the tea master, a true master of anything, if you're apprenticed to them, he is your teacher father. And this is way different from just being a Lao Shi, an old teacher. So naturally, I agreed to be his formal apprentice, and we did this whole ceremony. I gave him like 6 traditional symbolic gifts of fruit and nuts and tea and other things. And I kowtowed to him, kowtowed before him. This is that deep bow where you put your head on the floor. And my tea master gave me, several scrolls of Chinese calligraphy. He gave me a nice master-made I Ching teapot and a book of poetry. And together we formalized this bond in a very traditional way. And this is very unique and traditional and special, because when we were traveling together to these tea regions, he was telling people that I'm his apprentice. I'm his big apprentice, his da tu di. And so he has other students, apprentices, and stuff like that. But he makes a very big distinction for me where he tells people that I actually kowtowed to him, that I am in the traditional sense his actual apprentice. And when the other people in the tea regions hear this, they look at me in a slightly different light. And they understand the relationship between me and my master in a very different way, because it is much more like a family bond. We jokingly say he's my Chinese father. And our relationship is certainly much more like a father and a son more than a teacher and a student, because there are things that he does that I don't like. He smokes and stuff like that, and he doesn't teach me all the time. And this is gets into one of his really big things. He likes to tell me all the time about, in the ancient times, you apprentice for about 12 years with your master. And for the first 3 years, the apprentice doesn't do anything other than sweep the floors, clean the environment and stuff like that, and take care of the basic necessities for 3 years, while the master and his other apprentices do everything. The second set of 3 years, the apprentice is allowed to stand next to the tea master and his big apprentices while they're making tea, while they're doing all the very, very important things. But he still has to do all of the other work around. He still has to sweep the floor, mop the floor, fetch the water, all of that. But he's allowed a place at the table at this time. And my master is saying during this time, the apprentice isn't just sitting there idly, even though it might seem like that. He's learning. He's watching how the master does things. He's watching how the bigger apprentices do things. And then he's still taking care of the rest. For the third set of 3 years, he's allowed a place by the tea master's side. He's allowed to actually start making the tea and doing the things with the master's guidance and the occasional slaps on the back of the head. And then during the final 3 years, the fourth set of 3 years, he's actually allowed to sit down in the master's seat and make the tea while the master is away, while the master is busy and stuff like that. And so he's essentially given over the keys to the kingdom at this phase for another 3 years. And then the fifth set of 3 years, the big apprentice is kicked out. Essentially, go off, find your own fortune. You are your own master now. You were my apprentice. You can tell everyone. You can use my name high and low, far and wide. And that name alone will open doors for you. And that actually, I'll tell you a story later, that his name alone opened doors for me in the Westlake area of Hangzhou, where I walked into a tea house and they were like, "Oh, you're Yinshang's 2D. You're Yinshang's apprentice, aren't you?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I am." And they're like, "Have a seat, drink some of this chun ti zhong, handmade, roasted over the traditional wood-fired wok tea that I made 2 days ago that, I wasn't really going to sell, but only drink with some friends. But I think you could enjoy it." Stuff like that. And so I've been apprenticed to my master Yinwei for 7 years now. And while it seems like at the beginning it was really interesting, there's a whole lot I could learn, eventually it kind of became less and less fulfilling for me, especially as I started doing my own tea business and I got a little more busy. I was spending less time at his tea house, but every time I went back there, he was always gracious and happy to see me, and he never really pushes me or tells me I need to come too much or whatever. It's a very interesting relationship where, because we have this bond, it is a little more like a familial bond. Over the past few years here in China, we've had a lot of the COVID outbreaks and lockdowns and epidemic control systems and measurements. And every time one of these happens, he checks in on me, I check in on him. We both make sure that each other has enough vegetables and enough food. He's always worried I'm not eating enough, which I tend to skip meals and stuff like that. Every time he sees me, he tells me I've gotten skinnier and I need to eat more. And then he prepares food and stuff like that. And I know that if I ever run into any issues, any difficulties, I had a visa issue recently, like 2 years ago, last year, and he was really there for me. He was that core support. He was saying what he could do to help me out through it. And it really did feel like he was more of a father than just a teacher to me. And this relationship has grown even more important over the past few years, because I think 2 years ago his wife passed away. And he's not very old. I think he's 60, 65, 67. And his only daughter is living in another city. She married and moved in with her husband's family. And so during the holidays, my master Yinwei gets really lonely. And so I usually spend most of the holidays with him, because I can tell he still really hasn't gotten over the grief of his wife just yet. Because sometimes I catch him, with tears in his eyes when he finds an old object or a conversation hits a memory that's still too raw. And it's really, breaks my heart to see. And that's why it's ever more important for me to fulfill this, father-son kind of relationship, part of the apprenticeship, and visit him and help him watch the shop, eat with him, keep him company, really on these holidays especially. And so for the Spring Festival, I spent most of the Spring Festival there, even though it's a really good time for me to do some traveling, but it's really important. So I spend a majority of the time just sitting in the tea house and drinking tea with him and singing to the guests while he, plays cards with his friends and stuff like that. One thing that's interesting about my tea master is he wasn't always into tea. Like we see other people and they've, been born in the tea mountains, learned how to make tea when they were 8 years old, and have just been making tea all their lives. My tea master kind of falls into this second category of Chinese cultural masters. Somebody who's, made a decent living and then retired early and then taken up the role of a cultural preserver, somebody who's very interested in the intangible cultural history of China and preserving this kind of culture. And this is interesting because it reminds me of a few different things. First of all, there's a really interesting book, if you haven't read, called The Tao of Pu by Benjamin Hoff. And in this book, he talks about an old Chinese painting called The Vinegar Tasters. And there are 3 old men standing around a vinegar vat, and they're all drinking the vinegar. And one says, "Wow, the vinegar is so bitter, so hard, you should just not even drink it." The other one says, "Wow, this vinegar is so interesting. We can use this in cuisine. We can use it to cook with. We can exploit the virtues of it, even if it's not good on itself." And then the last drinker drinks the vinegar and says, "Wow, it tastes great. I love it." It's so interesting. And this is a reflection of the 3 main philosophies that have animated Chinese culture over the past few millennia. One of them is Confucianism. This is the one who drinks the vinegar and says, it can be fixed. And this is one who wants to live in society, correct society, and encourage the right path of things, wants to develop the human nature in the right direction, and puts a lot of work into this world. The one who drinks the vinegar and thinks it's bitter and should just be utterly rejected, that's Buddhism. That's the Buddha. And he says the world is suffering. We should not even engage with it, because the more we engage with it, the more we entangle ourselves with it, and the more we're snared by it. The third drinker, the one who drinks it and says, this is wonderful, this is a joy and a delight, this is Lao Tzu, this is the Taoism. And Taoism is one of the old folk religions that has kind of grown in the mountains of China. And ancient Taoism is very strange. It's not as the philosophical Taoism we know today. It's very much more about magic and ghosts and spirits. But the philosophical Taoism teaches that, life is a joy, pure experience is a joy. We should try and become as spontaneously ourselves as possible. And thus, in this book, in this painting, we see the 3 main philosophies animating the Chinese mind throughout history and their approaches to life. Drinking the vinegar is participating in life. And there's an old Chinese saying that's, when you're a child, you're a Taoist. You're happy about the world. When you're in the middle age, you're Confucius, you're Confucian, and that's when you want to get into society, develop society, set the groundwork for a good future. And then when you get old, you become a Buddhist, and that's when you retire from the world and you seek enlightenment through spiritual means. And so too, I've seen this development as well in ancient India. There's a thing called the ashram of Hinduism that breaks up life into four main parts. The four ashrams are first, the student or the apprentice. Second, we see the householder. Third, we see the forest walker, the forest dweller. And then finally, renunciation. And these are the four stages of life. At the beginning, you're a child, you're a student, you're learning. Then you're a Confucian, you're participating in the world. That's when you become a householder. And then you retire from the world. And this is retirement here. It's called forest dweller, forest walker. The idea, I think, in the ancient ashram idea is that you're traveling the world, you're experiencing life untethered. And then finally, we have renunciation. This is the Buddhist phase where you're retiring from the world and you're seeking your own enlightenment. Here in China, well, that might have been a thing 1,000 years ago. It doesn't quite hold up as well now, mainly because there is not a lot of deep religious fervor here in China. We see it in isolated pockets. We see it in certain regions, but it's not universal. A lot of people here are atheists. They don't believe in Buddhism, really. And so to say that at the end of your life you want to become a Buddhist, that doesn't appeal to most people. And so what I see happening a lot of times are these successful businessmen take the money and then they put it into these pet projects. And the pet projects are usually culturally inspired. They're seeking that attachment to a culture that's past, and they're creating this other kind of name for themselves, a master, a cultural master. And so my tea master, he worked most of his younger life, as a CEO of a car dealership, something totally unrelated to tea. And then I think when he was early 40s, he retired and put that all into tea and just started studying tea culture and all of this, and has just been developing himself here in Yangzhou for the past couple decades. And so when I first met him, he had this tea house on one of the main streets here in the city. And the tea house culture here in China is very interesting because it's almost like a kind of a membership. Like people can come in and just drink tea and chill. You have the people who consistently buy tea that, will play mahjong upstairs or something like that. And the first floor is just the relaxing lounge for people who can just come in if they're bored, just want to talk, drink tea. I rarely saw a lot of people buying tea very actively. It's a much more passive thing. Like maybe you'll buy five pounds of tea every few months, just do it very casually. But every time you go in, you're not asking, okay, what tea can I get 50 grams of? What tea can I get 25 grams of? Can I buy this teapot? Can I buy that teapot? I didn't see a lot of business going on in this tea house. I just saw a sense of community. People coming, loyal patrons, and they're just sitting there drinking tea, playing cards. Everyone will go out to eat dinner around 6 o'clock. And, I've met this whole ever-changing cast of characters by watching the tea table, standing in for my master when he's playing cards. And I've learned a lot of Chinese through this as well, because when my master's not present and somebody new comes into the tea house, I have to greet them, serve them tea, kind of chat them up and stuff like that. And I've been doing this for the past 7 years. Though, as I mentioned, I've been doing it a little less and less as time progresses. But one thing that I do is whenever my tea master calls, I always answer. Whenever he really asks me to come out, I do. And he invites me to a lot of these dinners. And I accompany with him a lot of times what he does. And it's a very interesting way for me to fulfill my duty as an apprentice. But my master doesn't drink alcohol. And sometimes he'll go to dinner with these really, big wigs who are like, the head of the Agricultural Development Committee for Jiangsu. And he wants to, talk about the tea production, stuff like that. And so he has a dinner with them. And then he invites me because I can drink. And so I am essentially his baijiu shield. And baijiu is this Chinese moonshine. It's really strong, 55% alcohol, 57% alcohol, and they drink it in 100 milliliter glasses, and they just drink it straight with dinner. They cheers each other, drink it all the time. And my tea masters taught me a whole lot of the Chinese drinking culture, which is incredibly complex and incredibly deep, because it all comes down to respect for people's different places in society. You have to understand who gets cheers first, if you stand up, if you sit down, who can cheers what, when. And my tea master, he'll just nudge me and tell me to do things, and I'm just essentially his surrogate drinker at these Chinese dinners. It's really interesting. Something I actually really don't mind because it's always a good time. Sometimes I drink a little too much because the Chinese drinking culture can push you a little too much sometimes. But a lot of times in China, this is how business is done. You eat, you drink, and you just hang out for a long time. And then at the very, very end, like the last couple minutes, then you do your business talk. And it's just like, for me as a Westerner, this sounds so different because you don't want to, persuade people in weird ways. You don't want to bribe people. You don't want to be like, oh, I'll treat you to dinner and then you do me this favor. That sounds weird. As an American, as a Westerner, I'm just like, tell me what you want and I'll agree to it if I want to agree to it, and I'll come to terms. Like, you don't have to do all this for me and then make me feel obligated to do it. But anyways, it's just a different culture. And so my tea master will take me alongside on all of these things, and I get a deep insight into how he does business, how Chinese people do business, and essentially the cultural etiquette of drinking of these big parties and whatnot. So, all right. So this episode turned into a huge homage to my tea master. Love him, God bless. And he is Master Yinwei. And I'll talk more about his trip that he took me on to Suzhou, to Hangzhou, all the friends I met through him on these recent trips, and just what a wonderful time that was. And so next episode, get ready for more of the tea travel stories, for tea production of the Bilo Chun. And again, this is Derek from One River Tea. Thanks for catching this episode of Tea Soup. And until next time, brew happy.